A nightmarish decision. Linda, an 8-year-old girl with eyes wide enough to hold the sky, had once thought her home was a fortress of love and laughter. That was before Ruth, her stepmother, arrived. Ruth, with her clipped voice and cold stares, had turned the once warm household into a battlefield. "Linda, how many times must I tell you? You're useless." Ruth's voice echoed through the living room, sharp as shattered glass, every syllable cut deep, tearing at Linda's fragile confidence. Mason, her father, used to be her protector. But now he was just a shadow of the man he once was, drifting aimlessly in Ruth's storm. He no longer defended her, choosing instead to disappear into his own silence. Linda, small for her age, but with a heart far too big for the pain she endured, tried to win back her father's attention. Yet every act of love seemed to be swallowed by Ruth's disdain. One night, Linda crouched in the shadows at the top of the staircase, her small fingers gripping the banister. Below, Ruth delivered an ultimatum that pierced the air like a dagger. "Mason, either you get rid of her, or I'm gone. I won't live another day in this house with her around." The words sank like stones into Linda's chest. Her small heart pounded as she strained to hear her father's response. He hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "Ruth, please, she's just a child," he murmured, but his voice wavered. He was a man teetering on the edge of despair, unwilling or unable to stand firm. Ruth's impatience ignited like a firecracker. "It's me or her, Mason. Enough excuses." Her voice lashed out with finality. Linda's breath hitched. Her father hesitated again, glancing at Ruth with a mixture of fear and resignation. Finally, he muttered, "You're right." His voice cracked, the words barely audible but heavy with the weight of betrayal. Linda's world shattered. She wanted to scream, but her voice refused to rise above the lump in her throat. "Dad," she whispered, her voice so small it was nearly consumed by the silence. Mason didn't look at her. "Go to your room, Linda," he said, his voice choked with guilt. "We'll figure this out tomorrow." A desperate journey. The next evening, Mason forced a smile. "We're going for a ride tonight, Linda. Just the two of us." His words felt hollow, but a flicker of hope ignited in Linda's chest. Perhaps this was his way of making amends, of reclaiming the bond they once shared. She nodded. "Okay, Dad," she whispered, her voice tentative, but laced with longing. The sea was restless that night, the waves rising and falling like the beating of a broken heart. Mason rowed silently, his hands trembling with every stroke. Linda sat at the edge of the boat, her small hands gripping the wooden sides. The farther they ventured, the more her unease grew. "Dad, why are we going so far?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mason stopped rowing and turned to face her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Linda, He couldn't finish. The words stuck in his throat like shards of glass. Finally, with a sudden, desperate motion, he stood. Linda's eyes widened in confusion and fear. "Dad," she whispered. "I'm so sorry," Mason choked out, his voice barely audible. Before Linda could react, he grabbed her and, with a pained cry, hurled her over the edge. The embrace of the sea. The icy water enveloped Linda, stealing the breath from her lungs. Panic surged through her as she thrashed against the unyielding waves. "Dad," she screamed, but the word was swallowed by the sea. Above her, Mason sat frozen in the boat, his hands gripping the oars as if they could anchor him to the remnants of his conscience. He watched his daughter disappear beneath the surface, his mind a cacophony of guilt and despair. Linda's small frame fought against the current, but the cold numbed her limbs. Her strength waned, and as she began to sink, a singular thought echoed in her mind. Why? Darkness closed in, wrapping her in a suffocating embrace. But just as the last vestiges of hope slipped away, a distant light pierced the void. A beacon of hope. Joe, a humble fisherman, was returning home after a long day at sea. His nets were empty, but his heart remained light. Then, amidst the rolling waves, something caught his eye. a small figure struggling against the tide. Without hesitation, Joe rowed toward the child. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice carried by the wind. He leaned over the side of his boat, stretching his arms as far as they could go. With a firm grip, he pulled Linda aboard. Her body was limp, her skin pale, but her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Joe wrapped her in an old blanket, his hands trembling as he murmured, "You're safe now, little one." Healing waters. Joe brought Linda to his modest cabin, a sanctuary filled with the warmth of a crackling fire. He tended to her with the care of a father who had once lost his own child. Days turned into weeks, and under Joe's patient care, Linda began to heal, not just her body, but the invisible wounds carved into her soul. At first, she barely spoke, her voice lost in the shadows of her trauma. But Joe never pressed her, offering instead a steady presence. He taught her to fish, to read the rhythm of the waves, and slowly, Linda began to see the sea not as her enemy, but as a vast expanse of possibility. In Joe's small village, Linda found something she thought she had lost forever, a sense of belonging. The villagers welcomed her with open arms, their kindness a balm for her wounded heart. Strength reclaimed. Linda grew stronger each day, her laughter returning like the first rays of sunlight after a storm. She still carried scars, but they became a testament to her resilience rather than a source of pain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Linda turned to Joe. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. Joe smiled, his weathered face softening. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, little one. Even when the world tries to take everything from you, there's always hope. You just have to hold on long enough to find it." Linda's story became one of survival, not just of the sea but of the cruel indifference of those who should have loved her. In Joe, she found a father who taught her that love isn't bound by blood, but by the choices we make to care for one another. And in herself, she found a strength she never knew she possessed, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, something incredible can happen. Journey to the unknown. The day had been unusually quiet. Linda sat by the window, watching the sun dip into the horizon, casting fiery streaks across the sky. Mason had barely spoken to her all day, his face hidden behind the veil of his own thoughts. When he finally approached her, his voice was softer than she had heard in months. "We're going for a ride tonight, Linda," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his weary eyes. "Just the two of us." Linda hesitated, her small heart daring to hope. It had been so long since they'd spent time together, just father and daughter. A flicker of joy sparked within her, pushing away the shadows of doubt. "Okay, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As the evening deepened, the air turned crisp, and Mason led Linda down to the small wooden dock behind their home. The boat, weathered and creaking, bobbed gently in the dark water. The sound of the waves lapping against its sides seemed to whisper secrets Linda couldn't understand. Mason helped her into the boat, his hands trembling as he did. Linda looked at him curiously. His movements were hesitant, his gaze darting nervously to the horizon. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice bright with the naivety of an 8-year-old who still believed in the possibility of magic. "Just out on the water," Mason replied, his words clipped, his tone distant. He began to row, each stroke pushing them farther from the safety of the shore. The sea was calm at first, its surface reflecting the moonlight like a vast, shimmering mirror. Linda leaned over the edge, her fingers skimming the water. She giggled softly, the sound a fleeting echo of the carefree child she once was. But as they drifted farther out, the air grew colder, and the once gentle waves turned restless. Linda wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "Dad, it's getting dark. Shouldn't we go back?" Mason didn't respond. He kept rowing, his face a mask of anguish. The silence between them grew heavy, suffocating. Linda felt a knot tighten in her stomach, a feeling she couldn't quite place but one that made her chest ache. "Dad?" She tried again, her voice small. "Where are we going?" Mason stopped rowing abruptly. The boat rocked slightly as he gripped the oars, his knuckles white. He avoided her gaze, staring instead at the endless expanse of water around them. His breaths came in shallow gasps, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. "Linda," he began, his voice trembling. I need you to know that I love you." The words startled her. She blinked, confused. "I love you too, Dad," she said, her tone filled with a childlike sincerity. "Why are you saying that?" Mason finally looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm so sorry," he choked out, his voice breaking. Linda's heart raced. "Sorry for what?" she asked, her voice laced with growing fear. Mason stood suddenly, the boat swaying beneath him. Linda instinctively reached out to steady herself, her wide eyes fixed on her father. He took a deep breath, as if trying to gather the strength to do the unthinkable. "Dad, what's wrong?" Her voice was trembling now, a plea for reassurance. "I can't do this anymore," Mason whispered, more to himself than to her. His movements were quick, desperate. Before Linda could process what was happening, he grabbed her by the arms, his grip firm but shaking. "Dad!" "No!" she screamed, panic flooding her tiny body as she struggled against him. "Please, Dad, don't." Tears streamed down Mason's face as he lifted her, his muscles tense with the effort of both his physical action and the emotional torment tearing him apart. "Forgive me, Linda," he whispered, his voice barely audible over her cries. And then, with a single decisive motion, he threw her over the side of the boat. The icy embrace. The cold hit Linda like 1,000 needles piercing her skin. She gasped, swallowing water instead of air, and her arms flailed instinctively. The sea pulled at her, its icy grip unforgiving. "Dad!" she screamed, her voice muffled by the churning waves. But the boat was already drifting away. Mason sat frozen, his hands clutching the oars as though they were the last lifeline to his humanity. He couldn't bring himself to look back, his mind consumed by a whirlwind of guilt and self-loathing. "What have I done?" he muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of his actions. Linda fought against the waves, her small body no match for the strength of the sea. Her limbs grew heavy, her lungs burning as she struggled to stay afloat. The salty water stung her eyes, and her cries for help grew weaker with each passing moment. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible as exhaustion overtook her. The question echoed in her mind, filling the spaces where hope once resided. Why had her father, the man she trusted above all else, done this to her? As the cold seeped deeper into her bones, Linda felt herself sinking, her vision blurred, the world above her reduced to a swirling haze of darkness and light. She stopped fighting, her body too tired, her spirit too broken. She closed her eyes, letting the sea carry her away. The rescue. Linda's body sank deeper into the frigid embrace of the sea, her limbs too weak to resist the pull of the waves. The salt stung her eyes, her lungs ached for air, and the overwhelming darkness closed in. Just as the last vestiges of hope slipped away, a faint sound, like the rhythmic creak of wood and the slap of oars against water, broke through her fading consciousness. The silhouette of a small fishing boat emerged against the silver glint of moonlight on the water. Joe, an old fisherman whose days were long, but whose heart was still tender, had spent hours at sea searching for a decent catch. The emptiness of his nets mirrored the loneliness he carried, but something tonight felt different, as though the restless sea itself were trying to speak to him. Through the mist, Joe noticed a disturbance in the water, a splash too large to be the usual toss of the waves. He squinted into the distance, his instincts sharp from years of reading the ocean's subtle language. A faint shape bobbed in the water, barely visible but unmistakably human. "Lord have mercy," Joe muttered, his voice tinged with urgency. Grabbing the oars, he rowed with a strength that belied his age, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged through him. "Hold on, whoever you are. I'm coming." As he approached, The full gravity of the scene became clear. A child, small, frail, and barely clinging to consciousness, floated limply in the water. Joe's hands trembled as he leaned over the edge of the boat, his calloused fingers stretching to grasp her. With a firm but gentle pull, he hoisted Linda out of the icy depths and into the safety of his vessel. Her body was cold, her skin pale as the moonlight reflecting off the waves. Her wet hair clung to her face, and her breathing was shallow, each gasp a fragile reminder of life still lingering within her. Joe wrapped her tightly in an old wool blanket, his rough hands moving with surprising tenderness. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He rested his hand on her forehead, feeling the faint warmth of her skin beneath the chill. "You're safe now. I've got you." Linda's eyelids fluttered open briefly, her gaze unfocused. She saw the outline of Joe's face, a mixture of concern and determination etched into his weathered features. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Joe leaned closer, his ear near her mouth. "Do you why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, each syllable a struggle. Joe didn't know the answer, but the pain in her voice filled his chest with a protective fury he hadn't felt in years. "You're going to be okay," he said firmly, avoiding the question. "Just hold on." A haven on shore. The journey back to shore felt endless. The sea, which had moments ago seemed eager to devour the child, now seemed almost serene, as if it had conceded to Joe's determination. He rowed with all his might, his old boat groaning under the strain, until finally the outline of the coastline emerged through the mist. Joe's cabin sat near the edge of the village, a modest structure made of weathered wood. It was unremarkable to most, but to Joe, it was a place of quiet refuge. Tonight, it would become a sanctuary. As soon as the boat scraped against the shore, Joe carried Linda inside, her small body still wrapped in the damp blanket. The warmth of the cabin greeted them, the crackling fire in the hearth a stark contrast to the coldness of the sea. Joe laid her carefully on a worn but comfortable couch, covering her with every blanket he could find. "Stay here, little one," he said gently, his voice steady. "I'll get you something warm." He moved quickly, heating a kettle of water over the fire and preparing a simple broth. As he worked, his mind raced with questions. Who was this child? How had she ended up in the middle of the sea? And most hauntingly, why was she alone? When Joe returned to her side, Linda's eyes were half open, her expression a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He knelt beside her, offering the steaming cup. "Drink this," he urged, holding the cup to her lips. "It'll help." Linda sipped hesitantly, the warmth spreading through her, chasing away the chill that had taken root in her bones. Her small hands trembled as she clutched the cup, her eyes meeting Joe's for the first time. There was a depth to her gaze that took him aback, a sorrow far too heavy for someone so young. "You're safe now," Joe said, his voice softer. "No one's going to hurt you." The steps toward healing. The hours passed slowly, the night stretching into morning. Linda drifted in and out of sleep, her small frame cocooned in warmth. Joe sat nearby, his rough hands clasped together as he kept watch. He had lived a solitary life for years, but something about this child awakened an old instinct within him, a need to protect, to nurture. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's windows, Linda stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time since Joe had found her, she spoke with clarity. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "You're safe," Joe reassured her. "You're in my home, by the shore. I'm Joe. What's your name, little one?" "Linda," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The name felt strange on her tongue, as if she were trying to remember who she was. Joe smiled gently. "Well, Linda, it seems like you've been through quite the ordeal. Do you want to tell me what happened?" Linda hesitated, her small hands clutching the blanket tightly. Memories of the night before flooded her mind. The boat, the cold, her father's face twisted in anguish. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I, I can't, she said finally, her voice breaking. Joe nodded, his expression understanding. That's all right. You don't have to talk about it until you're ready. Linda looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of safety, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The bond forged by kindness. Over the days that followed, Joe and Linda settled into an unspoken routine. He didn't press her for answers, instead offering small comforts, a warm meal, a gentle word, a steady presence. Linda began to explore the cabin, her curiosity slowly returning. She found seashells and bits of driftwood Joe had collected, arranging them into small patterns on the table. Joe watched her silently, marveling at her resilience. He saw the way she flinched at sudden movements, the way her eyes darted to the door as if expecting danger. But he also saw the spark of determination that hadn't been extinguished by her ordeal. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Linda sat on the porch steps, staring at the waves. Joe joined her, his presence quiet but reassuring. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently, sensing her inner turmoil. Linda was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "My dad. He threw me into the water." Joe's heart clenched, but he kept his expression calm. "I'm so sorry, Linda," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You didn't deserve that. No one does." Linda looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. "Why did you save me?" she asked. Joe smiled softly, his gaze warm. "Because everyone deserves a chance, Linda. Even when the world seems dark, there's always light to be found. Sometimes, you just need someone to help you see it." A new beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the small cabin by the sea became Linda's sanctuary. Joe continued to care for her with quiet determination, offering her the stability and kindness she had been missing. Linda, in turn, began to find her footing. The sea, once a source of terror, became a symbol of her resilience. Joe took her out in his fishing boat, teaching her to trust the rhythm of the waves. One day, as they sat together on the shore, Linda turned to Joe. "Do you think people can change?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Joe looked out at the water, his eyes reflecting its endless depth. "I think people can change if they want to, but they have to choose it. Sometimes, the hurt they've caused is too great to undo, but they can still decide to be better." Linda considered his words, her small hands sifting through the sand. "Do you think my dad will ever change?" Joe hesitated. He didn't want to give her false hope, but he also didn't want to extinguish the flicker of love she still held for her father. "That depends on him," he said gently. "But no matter what he chooses, it doesn't define who you are. You're stronger than you know, Linda. What he did to you, that's not your fault." Confronting the past. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, a visitor arrived at Joe's cabin. Linda peeked through the window and froze. It was Mason. He looked thinner, older, his shoulders weighed down by guilt. Joe stepped outside, meeting the man with a guarded expression. "I'm here to see my daughter," Mason said, his voice hoarse. I need to make things right." Joe's jaw tightened, his protective instincts flaring. "You have a lot to answer for," he said, his tone firm but measured. "But this isn't about what you want. It's about what Linda needs." Mason nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. "I know. I had to try." Joe stepped back inside and knelt down to Linda's level. "Your father's here," he said gently. "You don't have to see him if you don't want to. This is your choice." Linda's heart raced. The memory of that night on the boat was still vivid, but so was the love she once felt for her father. After a long pause, she nodded. "I'll see him," she whispered. Joe led her outside, staying close as she faced Mason. The man fell to his knees, his face streaked with tears. "Linda, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I was weak, and I made the worst mistake of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how much I regret what I did." Linda stared at him, her emotions a swirling tide. Part of her wanted to run, to hide from the pain he had caused. But another part, a braver, stronger part, wanted to face him. "You hurt me," she said, her voice steady, "and I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Mason nodded, his head hanging low. "I understand." But Linda continued, her voice softening. "I hope you can change. For yourself." Joe's chest swelled with pride. Linda's strength and grace in that moment were far beyond her years. Mason looked up at her, his face etched with remorse. "Thank you," he whispered. "The lesson in the waves." As Mason walked away, Joe placed a comforting hand on Linda's shoulder. "That took a lot of courage," he said. Linda looked out at the sea, its endless horizon stretching before her. "It still hurts," she admitted. "That's okay," Joe said. "Healing takes time, but you've already taken the hardest steps. You faced your past and didn't let it define you." Linda nodded, her gaze unwavering. "The sea tried to drown me, but I survived. I think I can survive anything now." Joe smiled. "You can, Linda, and you'll thrive. Remember, no matter what happens, you have the strength to create a new path for yourself. A bright future." Over time, Linda continued to grow, her confidence blossoming like flowers after a storm. The village embraced her fully, and with Joe's guidance, she began to see the world not as a place of danger, but as one of opportunity. The scars of her past didn't disappear, but they became a part of her story, a testament to her resilience. One day, as she stood at the edge of the water, watching the waves roll in, she turned to Joe. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Joe chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "I didn't do anything special. You're the one who decided to keep going, no matter how hard it got." Linda smiled. "You showed me I could." As the years passed, Linda's story became one of triumph, of hope rising from the depths of despair. She carried the lessons of her journey with her. That strength comes from within, that love is defined by action, and that forgiveness, while not always deserved, is a gift you give yourself. And the sea, once her greatest fear, became her greatest teacher, a reminder that even in its darkest moments, it holds the promise of calm after the storm. This ending encapsulates the themes of resilience, forgiveness, and growth, leaving readers with a sense of hope and inspiration.